Most of my bait fishing is done with one of two rigs, a running sinker rig or a Paternoster rig, and sometimes when I'm using two rods I'll use them both. Which one's best and why? Hey you! You're watching Robbie Fishing. Now there's no real way of knowing which one's best. In some situations the running sinker rig is best, and in other situations the Paternoster rig is best. Let's talk more about this. This is a running sinker rig. There are many different ways to tie a running sinker rig. It's called a running sinker rig because, as you can see, the sinker can run. It can run as far as it needs to run. Now some people will tie this rig so that the sinker can run all the way to the hook, but I don't. I like to tie something on the line about 20 or 30 centimeters up from the hook, a stopper, and in this case I've just got a tiny little twig. There's so many different ways to tie this, and that's the beauty of fishing. There's no right or wrong way. You might crimp a split shot sinker on there. Some people who are quite fussy will use some kind of a swivel, and then they'll have different leaders that they can clip on and off as they need to. But I'm very basic. I like to do things very basically, and I like to just have a running sinker that can run down to a stick in the line. And it doesn't have to be a stick, it can be a little bit of rubber, it can be anything, a bit of weed. Sometimes I use a bit of valve rubber. I've actually made a video on how to tie a running sinker rig the proper way, or what I believe to be the proper way, and that is with a bit of valve rubber with a match in it, so that you can pull the match out and slide the valve rubber up and down the line, and it makes it an adjustable stopper. But usually 9 times out of 10 I'll put the line through the sinker, tie the hook on the end, and then I'll tie a little stick just up from the hook so that the sinker can't run all the way. Now, what are the pros and cons of using a running sinker rig? The best thing about a running sinker rig is that it allows you to fish unweighted from the bank without sacrificing any casting distance. So you can use a sinker, but once it's in the water, that is loose and it runs. So when a fish grabs the bait and swims, it pulls the line. It doesn't feel the resistance from the sinker, and it doesn't feel the resistance from the rod tip until it takes up the slack. So quite often if you're getting just a few nibbles and they're struggling to hook up, you can clip the bail open on your rod and just let the fish swim with the bait until you think it's had it long enough. Then you can close the bail and set the hook. That's the best part of a running sinker rig. I like a running sinker rig when I'm trout fishing. Trout are quite a smart fish, and when they feel the weight of the sinker or the weight of the resistance from the rod tip, quite often they will let go of the bait and move on because they sense that something isn't right. So somewhere like Lake William when I'm trout fishing, I'll use a running sinker rig where I can cast a long way out and still be able to fish relatively unweighted, pretty much unweighted. The downsides to a running sinker rig, it's not particularly good if you're using a live bait, particularly something that'll bury into the mud like a yabby or a shrimp, and I would imagine in the salt water a crab would probably be the same. That's no good to you if that's sitting there but the yabby or the bait has dug 2 inches into the mud and the fish can't see it. So it's not really good in that situation. It's not particularly good in current either, because the current takes up the slack. The whole idea is that the fish can take up the slack as it needs to. So it's not great in the current, and it's not great with a bait that will dig into the mud. And probably the biggest downside to the running sinker is I find that it does tend to result in a lot more gut hooked fish than what the Paternoster rig does. So it gives you a more stealthy mode. It's definitely the better rig for increasing your hookups. So when I'm fishing, if I'm getting lots of nibbles and lots of bites and the fish aren't hooking up on my Paternoster rig, I'll often switch to a running sinker to try and turn those nibbles into hookups. If I'm fishing somewhere where the fishing is nuts and I'm catching heaps of fish, well then I'm going to gut hook more of those fish with a running sinker, so I'd prefer to use a Paternoster rig. So the main benefit of a running sinker rig is to be able to fish unweighted, and it's particularly handy when you're fishing for trout with worms or a mud eye or power bait or whatever you want to be using, but not really good if you're using a yabby that's going to bury into the mud. Now let's have a look at a Paternoster rig. Right, now this is a Paternoster rig. A Paternoster rig is where you tie a sinker to the end of the line and then you form a loop up the line and attach the hook to the loop. I've got quite an old video on my channel, but it's still relevant on how to tie a Paternoster rig. I'll see if I can find it, and I'll put a link in the end screens at the end of the video. So this is a basic Paternoster rig, and I know you can't see this very well on there, and unless I use white cord or something, it's going to be a bit hard to see. So I've tied the sinker on the bottom, I've then formed a loop in the line, and then rather than tie the hook on, you poke the end of the loop through the eye of the hook, you pull it over the top of the hook and pull it tight. So essentially you don't actually tie the hook on with a Paternoster rig, it just loops over and stays there. And the beauty of that is that you can change hooks. If you're hooking fish and they keep getting off, you might want to go to a bigger hook. If you're getting lots of bites that aren't hooking up, rather than go straight to a running sinker rig, you might just want to change hooks and try a smaller hook. That's one beauty of a Paternoster rig. The other beauty is that if you're using a live bait like a yabby or a shrimp or a crab or something, or depending where you are in the world, you might even be using some kind of a live fish, it will keep it off the bottom. As you can see there's my sinker, and even when hanging down, my hook is 20 centimeters above the sinker. So if I'm fishing straight down under a boat or off a steep ledge or off a log or something, there's no way that yabby can hide. When you cast out, that puts the line on more of an angle, and it makes it a little bit easier for the bait to hit the bottom, but it's still very, very hard and it's very restricted, and you're in control. So you can, if you wanted to, you can just tie another loop right at the top here and have your hook 2 feet off the bottom if you want to. This is particularly handy if you're fishing in areas where there's a lot of weeds. A running sinker rig's no good in the weeds because your bait will hide. This, if you know that you're in water, say 6 feet deep, and there's 2 feet of weeds, well, you might choose to put the loop and your hook 2 or 3 feet up above the sinker, so to keep the bait above the weeds. It's very handy in weeds. It's very handy for keeping the bait off the bottom, as I said. It's handy that because you can change hook sizes. Once you've done it a few times, they're quite easy to rig. They do take a bit of practice at first. The other good thing about it is, I don't know, depending where you're watching in the world, I don't know how many, you can have as many hooks as you want. Here in Victoria, we're only allowed to have 2 hooks per rod. 2 rods with no more than 2 hooks on each rod. So I'm well within my rights to form another loop in the line up here, wrap it around, tie it, put another hook on, and then I've got 2 hooks in the water instead of 1, and that will increase my chances of catching a fish, and it also gives me greater flexibility over bait. I'm not restricted to just 2 baits or 1 bait. I can have 2 different baits on 2 different rods. Although, as I did find out the hard way many years ago, I had 2 baits on it, a double Paternoster rig. I had a yabby on the bottom and a worm on the top. And would you believe it, the yabby ate the worms. Even though it had a hook through its tail, it still ate the worms. But anyway, you might want to have one with cheese for cod and one with worms for yellow belly. That's particularly handy for people who are only fishing with 1 rod but still want to use 2 baits. So the Paternoster rig, I think the running sinker rig is a much more stealthy approach. I love the idea of the fish being able to pick up the bait and not feel the weight. With this, the moment the fish grabs that bait, it's going to feel one of 2 things. It's either going to feel the weight of the sinker, or it's going to feel the resistance of the rod tip as it tries to swim off. One way around that is to use a smaller sinker. That's okay if you're in a small waterway, but it's not much good if you're in a lake because you'll sacrifice too much casting distance, or if you're in a river, the current will wash your sinker around too much. So a smaller sinker will overcome the problem, but it will create other problems. So that's why I sometimes use a running sinker rig and a Paternoster rig. I'll give you a couple of examples. If I'm up at Lake William Hovell fishing for trout off the bank or redfin, I'll usually have 1 of each because the Paternoster rig has its benefits, as I've already stated, but I also like the Paternoster rig when I'm redfin fishing as well. The running sinker rig is what I prefer for trout fishing because for the reasons mentioned, it can swim off with the bait. So I'll often have 1 of each, but if I was going to have 2 the same, it would most likely be a running sinker rig. I prefer the running sinker rig when I'm trout fishing with worms because the worms aren't going to bury into the ground or anything. When I'm Murray cod fishing, it's almost always a Paternoster rig because Murray cod are a very hard-hitting fish. So the Paternoster rig will keep if it's a bardy grub or a bit of cheese, it'll keep it off the bottom and on display. And when it's in the current, if the sinker sits still down here, the bait can wave around in the current up here a little bit and attract the fish's attention. And Murray cod are a very hard striking fish. When they hit the bait, they just go bang, and a lot of the time they hook themselves. So I like the Paternoster rig because it keeps the bait off the bottom and out in the open and easy for the cod to see. When I'm yellow belly fishing, either way, either. And even lately with the redfin, one day up at Lake Hume recently, I had a wonderful time and all but one fish were caught on the running sinker rig. Then there was a time at Lake Murimi recently where the Paternoster rig done all the damage. So they've both got their place, but for those of you asking which ones do I prefer, the Paternoster rig or the running sinker rig, and why do I change? I hope I've answered all those questions in this video. Thank you all very, very much for watching, and I hope you found this video informative.